Hello, everyone. I'm State Representative John Lesch, and this is Representative Marion O'Neill. And we're here today to present a new model for addressing sexual harassment complaints against members at the Capitol. Now, historically, there has been a process, an HR process, for individuals who are not members. But those of us who are legislators are afforded a unique kind of power in the sense that when a boss finds fault or liability and then assesses some kind of punishment, our bosses are the people of our district on election day. And if something happens over the course of the 2 years, or in the case of the Senate and sometimes 4 years, what happens? How are people punished? How are legislators punished for bad action? And more importantly, how are our constituents protected in their constitutional right to petition their government for a redress of grievances? So currently there is no mechanism by which lobbyists and others who may be victims of sexual harassment to seek accountability. The only mechanism is a complaint to the Ethics Committee. But in order to do that, a person at the Capitol has to get 2 legislators to sign off on a complaint. And oftentimes, it's the experience of folks around here that something goes to the Ethics Committee and sits there and dies on a tie vote, because the Ethics Committee in the House and in the Senate, they're tied based on rule. There's even number of Republicans and Democrats, and people have a tendency to protect their own. So the process that we propose, number one, it requires that any complaint, it go to the majority leader and the minority leader. And the complaint process is automatic, meaning that as soon as any accusation or allegation goes forward, then the majority leader and the minority leader automatically forward that to the Ethics Committee without any kind of consideration. They do not decide whether they support it or not. It is automatic if it's a sexual harassment complaint. Second, the process is at that point non-public to protect the identity of the victim and the identity of the accused. And more importantly, I think, for those that are concerned that a complaint would go and just languish in the Ethics Committee, it requires the Ethics Committee to act on this in a certain amount of time. So 30 days, within a certain amount of time, the Ethics Committee is required to make a probable cause finding to determine whether there is adequate evidence to proceed forward with a hearing on the merits. If they do find that, then the complaint becomes public, and the accuser is protected based on that finding of probable cause. And then there is a full public vetting and hearing on the merits, and immediately thereafter, the Ethics Committee has a limited amount of time to actually make a dispositional ruling, and what the consequences are can be anything from a private reprimand all the way up to the person being kicked out of the body. And the Constitution makes clear that it is the decision of the House of Representatives to make decisions on who sits in our bodies, so we can virtually kick anyone out. One of the primary complaints that I've heard from folks, lobbyists or activists at the Capitol, is that there's really no incentive for them to make a complaint. You saw the recent news of sexual harassment complaints against members, that they languished for quite a few years out of fear from folks whose stake is having their job here and working here. What's the incentive to tarnish themselves for the next few years for their job? But that has begun to change. People are coming forward saying no more, this has to stop, and we are attempting to put forward a process by which it is safer for these folks to do so and to have a redress of their grievances against specific members. So another reason why I wanted to bring this forward is because of the concerns on both sides. Concerns that we've seen so far from folks who are victims or accusers are that, number one, they won't be believed. Number two, that there will be no consequences for the harasser. Number three, they risk their reputation. they risk their job, and they risk their career in all. We also would hear complaints from those who are accused. Number one, that they won't be believed, the same as a person who accuses. Number two, that an accusation equals a conviction. Number three, the lack of any objective due process. And number four, one size fits all justice. So we've seen certain instances where those, to borrow from my experience as a criminal prosecutor, people who are guilty of petty misdemeanors are being lumped in with individuals who are clearly guilty of felonies. Furthermore, folks who are guilty of felonies, if they are grouped in with people that are guilty of misdemeanors, we have somehow have a self-imposed cap on our level of punishment, and that's wrong too. There needs to be commensurate punishment that fits the crime. So that is what we propose to do with the fast-track process, to maintain fairness for both the accuser and the accused, and ensure that this process is completed in a limited amount of time in order to protect the accuser and the accused. And with that, I would turn it over to Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Representative Lesch. And I want to point out that this is a bipartisan effort. Representative Lesch is a Democrat. I'm a Republican. I serve on the Ethics Committee. This is incredibly an important thing to move forward. This workplace has to be a safe place. That's our number one goal. And the only way to do that is to change the process. Make it simpler, make it easier, make it more fair for everybody involved, both the accused and the accuser. Due process is incredibly important. This assures due process. It also assures privacy. While you're going through the evidentiary value of the evidence, you have to make sure that there is substantial evidence to move it forward. You know, we've seen too much of being basically tried in the public sphere, and that's very difficult. We're in a political environment, and that is a very challenging place to be. This makes it more fair. It makes it fair for the people that work here, and it makes it fair for the people that are members like myself and Representative Lesch and our colleagues. So that's why we're proposing that today. We want to make sure that it's open to more, not just members, but also the lobbyists that work here and call this their workplace, to the staff that call this their workplace, and of course, due process for the member. Because short of that, the media, is fair game to everyone, and it's been a very difficult process. The most important thing is truth. We need to believe the women, but we need to verify and make sure that the accusations are true. So this process is a fair and it's a fair process to determine what that is.
We will stand for questions here in a minute, but I did just want to point out that this proposal will be a motion to modify House rules that require these complaints to go forward to the Ethics Committee. But what it will also do is include a component of statutory change. So those of you who are wondering, why has the legislature exempted itself from the Data Practices Act, right? I know some of you are wondering that. Okay, fair question. Representative Thiessen had floated a bill out there a couple years ago saying we would subject ourselves to it. Obviously, that would go through the committee process. There are a lot of questions about what should and shouldn't, namely private data from constituents. But I signed on to that bill. What we are doing here in this statutory change is we are applying the Data Practices Act to the legislature insofar as it is impacted by this rule. So if a sitting legislator was accused by a lobbyist or a constituent or an activist who was here at the Capitol, that legislator could not leak that person's name. If they did, they would be subject to penalties under Chapter 13, the Data Practices Act, just like anyone would, like the DNR guy who released the names or other people who disclosed other types of private data that was non-public. So that is the statutory change. The primary body of our proposal is in a House rule that we would impose on ourselves. And with that, we would stand for questions.
So is there a change in House rules? Is this coming in the form of a bill?
It comes in the form of a motion. So as soon as the legislature convenes in February, we will put this on the floor. I know that I've spoken with my leader, Representative O'Neill has spoken with her leader. I also have spoken with Representative Pepin, the majority leader, and she would expect this would go to the Rules Committee. So the way we're going to propose this is a motion for this to go before the Rules Committee. It would require a 2/3 vote on the floor of the House if we just wanted to change rules on the floor. We're not going to do that because we think that this requires proper vetting. There are going to be folks on both sides who are going to have problems with this. Some folks I know, lobbyists I've talked to, they have said to me, well, let me get this straight. So your new process means that I still have to go before legislators to complain, legislators who would sit in judgment of their colleagues. And I said, fair point. That can be intimidating. But until we have a constitutional amendment, the legislature is still the final arbiter of the behavior of its members under the Constitution. And so going beyond that would require a lot broader process.
One of your bullet points here says both the accuser and the accused may be reimbursed by the House for reasonable attorney costs. Does that include when there's a substantiated allegation that the taxpayers would pay the attorney's fees for somebody who was found to be guilty or whatever term you want to use of harassment?
That's a good question. We have not designated that, and that is part of the reason for this to go through the Rules Committee. I don't know the answer to that. I know that in the criminal justice system, we guarantee people who can't afford an attorney the right to an attorney regardless of that. Whether that's something that we make a decision, we're going to afford that to accused is a whole other question. So I don't know the answer to that yet, but conceivably.
And why just confine this to just sexual harassment issues in terms of the ethics proceedings? Why not make this the rule in general for bad conduct that the Ethics Committee takes up? And maybe Representative O'Neill, since you're on the committee, you might want to.
Yeah, so I've served on the Ethics Committee this biennium, and we haven't not had a single complaint come to the Ethics Committee. But you can see, what's happening in the media, what's happening in the nation right now is sexual harassment. So we want to start with where the world is right now. Where is Minnesota today? Today, the issue is sexual harassment. So we will cross that bridge when we come to it if there's something in a greater scope that's important, but for today, it's sexual harassment.
It really says that specific factual evidence is required. If something happens behind closed doors and it's just between two people, how do you expect to have evidence of that? Isn't it that just a game of he said, she said?
Well, that is still factual evidence. So an accusation is evidence. It may end up just being a he said, she said situation. And, as a prosecutor in the criminal courts, yes, we wouldn't bring a case for that reason because our burden in criminal courts is beyond a reasonable doubt. But in a civil context like this, it becomes far more relevant because it comes down to who is more believable. And if a member who is accused has multiple accusations, it can tend to make the accuser more believable. I mean, there are other factors involved there, but that is something, the accusation, that I would hope comes forward because of that aggregate impact.
And I would say, too, serving on the Ethics Committee, something that's important as well is what happened right after that event. So did that woman go and tell her husband? Did she go and tell another staff person? Did she tell anybody? And I believe we can look at that as well as testimony for something that happened just after and who she spoke to about it.
Is testimony before the Ethics Committee under oath?
Yes, the proposal for this will be that the testimony will be under oath.
Walk us through a little bit more about the current process and how this, what's lacking in the current process. You touched on that it can take a while. But how exactly does that work now?
Thank you for asking. So in order for a complaint to come to the Ethics Committee, 2 members of the House have to bring forward the complaint. And how this changes it is that you've got a complaint comes from, say, a lobbyist or a staff person, and it goes to the minority leader and the majority leader. And they automatically, because of this change, will send it to the Ethics Committee. So you can imagine the challenge, if you're a lobbyist here, to find 2 members that are willing to bring forward your complaint. And they just don't. And like I said, I've been on the Ethics Committee now for a biennium, and not a single complaint has come forward. And yet many complaints have come, and we're aware of many complaints through the press.
And I would add this too. So what happens is, in the current process, if, let's say, a Republican is accused, 2 Democrats sign off on the ethics complaint, okay? The ethics complaint goes to the Ethics Committee where it sits because it's seen as a completely partisan, or it can be seen as a partisan motivation based on the fact of the people who bring it. In this case, we remove that stigma by requiring that it be the majority and minority leader that are going to be opposite parties, that it go automatically. So it already takes away that stain of motivation. It also removes not just partisan bias, but historically in the legislature, if someone is liked, there is a less likely chance that they're going to get brought up on charges. It's just true. That's the way it is in anybody. That's the way it is in a workplace that doesn't have an ethics committee. And by an accusation becoming an automatic complaint that must be vetted before a probable cause body, hopefully that means that accusers are protected.
So you think over the years then there have been a large number of complaints that didn't become official complaints because of that hurdle?
Not just with sexual harassment, but when someone gets a DWI, for example, I mean, is there a decision about whether whereas that's equal to, like, let's say, domestic assault. If someone is convicted of domestic assault, we brought at this complaints with domestic assault, but now with the DWI. Under the law, they're even, but before the body, they're considered politically different, but it also weighs heavily on who's accused. And that becomes difficult. I think it poses questions of bias for us when that happens.
Senator Hayden is proposing an idea, he's at least mulling an idea similar to an ombudsman's office. That would be potentially a permanent fixture, perhaps living in the LCC. Would this proposal preclude that? Because it sounds like what you're proposing is hiring an attorney on an as-needed basis, just returning an attorney episode per episode, if you will. Would your idea preclude that other idea?
It would not preclude that, and we could certainly do that. An ombudsperson would be viable. I historically, I don't know, when it comes to ombudspersons for different departments, I've not generally been in favor of those because I'm not sure how effective they've been. I think that a due process, a system, or an adversarial process is better able to vet out fault and determine an appropriate level of punishment.
So if I'm reading this correctly, from start to finish, a decision would come within 3 months, but sooner if no probable cause exists. 3 months is the most it would take to
That's
get there.
correct. But just, you know, if there's no finding of probable cause, you'd never know about it. You won't hear about it.
How do you prevent that from happening? I mean, a lot of people do come to the media, or the media is coming to them. So I understand confidentiality and privacy, but it seems like the cat's a little bit out of the bag, and I don't know how you sort of manage that.
Well, that's true, and I have an opinion on this, and I'm not sure Representative O'Neill does, but people are still free to bring it to the media, and that will still happen in many cases. But let's say I think of some of these lobbyists who, they still want to be lobbyists, and they still want to have their jobs around here, and they know that they have had stuff happen to them, and they know other women have had stuff happen to them that will be believed as well. And they can't take that to the media because, you know, if the accused is a likable person and dodges accountability, well, they're done. They don't have a job anymore. But in this process, they'll still have a shot at keeping their job. And I think that was one of the major reasons why some of this stuff didn't come up for years. But media is still a viable option.
Representative Lesch, last week, when it came to the Senator Franken situation, you said that there was much debate among DFLers about what he should do, and the fact that he just said he was going to resign made an investigation moot. There's still a lot of DFLers who think he was perhaps railroaded. Are you among them?
Yeah.
So do you think he should stay?
Well, I'll qualify that. I don't know, because in my opinion, the only people that are in a position to decide whether Senator Franken did the right thing are Senator Franken and his accusers. Those are the only people, and that's because there has been no due process hearing. So I feel a little weird about saying yes or no, because I was surprised to hear the accusations. At the same time, as a person who's an officer of the court, whether I'm surprised to hear accusations or not, I'm still going to want to hear the background behind them. So I am loath to say whether he should have resigned or not. I think before I've heard any of that evidence, I'm not in a position to say he should resign.
He he hasn't submitted his formal papers or given a date as to when he'll leave. What do you want to see done between now and the time he does?
Well, the ship has sailed. I mean, he's resigned. He has lost the confidence of over, I think, half the members of his own caucus based on that aggregate effect. So I think it becomes a de facto resignation. I don't know how he survives it. And he made the decision that he needed to make. But there's no question about it. I'm among DFLers who feel uneasy about it based upon the lack of due process.
Representative O'Neill, you mentioned that you want this to become a safe workplace. Have you personally felt it's an unsafe workplace, or have you felt that it's an unsafe workplace for your committee aides or your staff aides?
So thank you for that question. I have not experienced any kind of sexual harassment myself here at the legislature, but when I was in my 20s and much less powerful and much less vocal and a different person, really, I did experience horrible sexual harassment, the worst kind of sexual harassment. So I'm here today to make sure that that doesn't happen to somebody here. Have I seen that happen to someone here? I have not. Has someone come to me and told me that that's happened to them? They have not. But I want to make sure that we have a process that if someone does have that experience, that they have a place that they can go that is as safe as we can make it, and that we can deal with it in a due process way. Because you know what happens when you don't have due process? You have an environment where false allegations can become a political weapon. And the last thing we want is to have a sexual harassment claim, just the claim alone, become a political weapon. That makes a toxic environment for all of us who have experienced horrible, horrible sexual harassment, and we are less likely to be believed. And I'm trying to make a process where those that have been sexually harassed, like I was in my 20s, to be believed, and they have a platform to be able to do that.
So you're trying to balance making sure that those claims come forward, but then also making sure that those claims aren't used as a political weapon. I mean, you're looking at both ends of that here, right?
Yes, absolutely. The last thing that we want is due process to just disappear and it become a political weapon. This assures that both the victim and the accused have due process. They both need due process. They both need justice. And so that's what I think this process does.
We saw an episode where a false allegation, and there was an attempt to plant a false allegation in the press in Washington, and the press discovered it before it went forward. Did that influence this decision in any way? Was that part of your fear, what you're talking about right now?
Not for me. I didn't know that that happened, but we live in a very political environment, and I know the potential is there.